For those of you who haven't met me, I'm Mike Madison. I'm a law professor at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law, and welcome to this virtual seminar series on the future of law in technology and governance, which is underwritten by and supported by the Center for Governance and Markets at the University of Pittsburgh. So my thanks to the center and to the team for making this series possible. Our kickoff speaker and presenter for the fall 23 semester is, I'm going to mangle the name, having just been reminded of exactly how to pronounce it. It's Salome Filioen, which has to be close, if not quite right.
That's pretty good.
Thank you. Trying to evoke my Scandinavian and Northern European ancestry. Salome is an assistant professor of law at the University of Michigan, and she is the author of a large and rich body of work already at a relatively early stage in her career, having to do with data governance in contemporary technology settings. And I'm not going to give away more of her story than that, simply to welcome Salome to the seminar. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to her and mute myself. She's going to talk until about 1:30 hour, and at that point, we'll open it up for questions. Okay, thank you, and off we go.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike, for the introduction. Yeah, it's really a pleasure to be able to join you all and to talk about this work a little bit. So I'm going to be presenting work that's drawing on a paper that I have forthcoming from the Berkeley Journal of Law and Technology, or Berkeley Technology Law Journal, I think it's called now. And it's co-authored with two friends of mine, Chris Morton, who is a professor at Columbia Law School, and he really focuses on healthcare, and a friend of ours, Gabe Nicholas, who's a technologist at the Center for Democracy and Technology. So this piece is really kind of the culmination of a bunch of conversations we've had. And yeah, so looking forward to sharing it with you all and getting your thoughts on this piece. So, oh yeah, and I should say the piece is called Researcher Access to Social Media, Lessons from Clinical Trial Data Sharing. That's kind of, it's all in the descriptive title we have here. So in 2018, researchers at Harvard and Stanford announced with great fanfare that they had entered into this landmark voluntary relationship with Facebook called Social Science One to gather and share data on the inner workings of the social media Goliath. 4 years later, now 5 years later, Social Science One is kind of remembered as this fiasco. Facebook ended up delivering only a fraction of the data it had promised to researchers. Technical fixes made by the company to protect user privacy rendered certain swaths of the data sets completely useless for research. Research conducted with Social Science One data was skewed, and funders, academics, and civil society partners all eventually withdrew from the project. So all in all, Social Science One is kind of widely considered a failure. Nate Persily, one of the co-founders, said this. He said, "I'm happy to be quoted saying this. This was the most frustrating thing I've been involved in my life." Persily later stated that the demise of Social Science One, quote, "demonstrates why we need government regulation to force social media companies to develop secure data sharing programs with outside independent researchers." So that's Social Science One. In 2020, researchers at NYU's Ad Observatory sought to investigate political advertising and electoral races on Facebook. And they announced that they were going to take a different approach to studying these phenomena on Facebook, right? They were going to do independent large-scale research conducted without the company's consent. They basically reached out to people individually, had them download kind of an independent kind of plugin to track their Facebook data. Sort of by browser extension. It was externally audited for security and privacy, and it scraped ad data from Facebook, contributing it to an academic database. So months later, while that research was underway, Meta suspended the Ad Observatory researchers' access to Facebook and therefore kind of killed the project. So even since writing our piece, more anecdotes kind of highlighting the fragility and inadequacy of existing approaches to social media research have cropped up. This is not just a Facebook problem, right? It's an ecosystem-wide problem. So in February of 2022, Elon Musk announced that Twitter's API access would no longer be freely available to researchers. And this is really a huge deal for the social media research community because the Twitter API has sort of long been a backbone of that kind of research. So in March of 2022, academics were sent documents stating that the enterprise packages for research would be available for a price. The cheapest, which gives access to 50 million tweets, will set you back $42,000 a month. The most expensive, which will give you access to $200 million tweets, costs $210,000 a month. So as Twitter is sort of winding down its free API, TikTok announced that it would provide data access to qualified researchers through a new API. But as pieces have kind of highlighted, kind of coming out about that API, it's terribly limited. I'm not going to go into all the gory details, but the research designs are subject to TikTok approval. Data retention policies violate most fields and journals rules. TikTok retains rights to the research products, again, in violation of most peer-reviewed journal standards. And in conducting research on their API, you grant them permission to use your institution's name and branding for promotion, which of course, no researcher is in a position to grant. So that's what's going on over at TikTok. So this piece is really us kind of pointing out that lack of researcher access to social media data matters a great deal, right? It matters because social media platforms are some of the 21st century's most powerful political and economic actors. Social media itself allegedly causes or contributes to myriad problems that affect billions of users around the world. Of course, commentators have argued inter alia that it fuels misinformation, political polarization, hate crimes and genocide, crises of mental health, including increases in teen suicide, the economic collapse of journalism, and so forth. And we really kind of take the social scientific view that to understand and address these problems in a data-driven way, we have to understand how these systems are working, how they're contributing to these problems, if they are, how they're exacerbating those problems. And to do that, we need researchers to understand, independent researchers to understand how these systems are working. And a lot of researchers want to study these problems, right? They go to great lengths to do so. But when platforms wield absolute legal control over who is given access to that data and on what terms, they can and they do thwart this critical bottleneck line of research. So unsurprisingly, a number of lawmakers and regulators and activists are advocating for an expanding array of new laws that would mandate social media companies provide some amount of information on their inner workings to independent researchers. A provision sort of allowing vetted researcher access is included in the European Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act. And in the US, we had in the last congressional term and also reintroduced in this term, the Bipartisan Platform Accountability and Transparency Act. Researcher access is also included in a number of upcoming bills. I think somebody is not muted, maybe could, okay, great. So that's kind of where we are. Yet laws mandating researcher access to social media data are controversial and they're untested and they're being unsurprisingly fought by dominant social media platforms, as well as some independent privacy advocates. And we sort of see two kind of primary arguments against granting access, right? First and foremost, platforms and advocates suggest that sharing data with researchers will harm user privacy. Social media companies wield privacy at both doctrinal and kind of normative theoretical levels, arguing that researcher access would violate extant laws like the GDPR in the EU, and that researcher access is normatively undesirable because irresponsible researchers will expose all of us who use social media to a raft of harms that outweigh the researchers' foreseeable benefits. The second kind of primary line of argumentation that these companies use and advocates is that these laws would raise serious concerns over and erode their intellectual property. So again, these objections operate at both doctrinal and theoretical levels. So companies assert that researcher access would violate state and federal trade secrecy laws, and they assert that researcher access is also normatively undesirable, right? Because it would expose their proprietary algorithms, encourage free writing by competitors, and therefore undermine innovation. So kind of the animating question here is, can law mandate and create meaningful researcher access to social media data while simultaneously kind of protecting privacy and incentives to innovate? And we think the answer is yes. Our contribution to the current debate is based on lessons that we can derive from other older fields of technology. So we can kind of take on the doctrinal arguments. Chris and I in privacy and trade secrecy separately have done that in other work. But here we're sort of trying to peek over the curtain at what has happened in other high technology industries to say, what can we learn? What are some parallels that we can draw from other more mature, more regulated industries to kind of resolve this conundrum? And so here we're really looking at pharmaceuticals, biotech, and medical devices. And in these areas, law has successfully established mechanisms for sharing of what would otherwise be secret industry data and have achieved some level of effective public oversight. And along the way, law and the institutions that sort of developed to implement those new laws have successfully navigated kind of similarly narrow straits between potential harms to individual privacy and harms to incentives to innovate. So we really focus in this piece on one specific kind of data generated and held by pharmaceutical companies, which is clinical trial data. Clinical trials are really expensive to conduct. Their data is enormously valuable to the business decisions of these companies. It sort of promises regulatory approval, marketing, future scientific research, all of that. Until the 1990s and the 2000s, the pharmaceutical, biotech, and medical device industry could and did keep the results of their clinical trials proprietary. The result was kind of a comparative dark age of information, with drug companies sort of cherry picking the most favorable data for publication in the medical literature and withholding the rest. A series of high-profile scandals kind of ensued, where companies had hid unfavorable data from independent researchers and the broader public, and as a result, caused widespread harm to patients. People here may remember some of these scandals involving blockbuster drugs like Paxil and Vioxx. So these scandals ultimately provoked landmark federal legislation in 2007, the Food and Drug Administration Amendments Act, FDAAA, that for the first time mandated that the industry share clinical trial data at a baseline level across the board and across the entire industry. And today, independent researchers around the world use this data to check industry claims. They use it to check the work of the industry's central regulator, the FDA. They identify unsafe and ineffective products, and just generally are engaged in the work of advancing science. So before the FDAAA was enacted in 2007, unsurprisingly, the pharmaceutical, biotech, and medical device industries fought it, right? Mobilizing privacy and incentives to innovate arguments that are really similar to the ones that social media companies are deploying today. So for example, the largest pharmaceutical lobby warned that the law mandating clinical trial would, quote, fail to protect adequately trade secrets and confidential commercial information, and therefore, quote, harm the public health by discouraging the very innovation necessary to bring new medical advances to the market. So when promulgating the rule that implemented FDAAA, the National Institutes of Health was threatened with takings litigation by the largest medical device industry lobby for allegedly illegal interference with their trade secrets. Industry commentators also alleged that the same NIH rule threatened, quote, the maintenance of patient privacy and would improperly breach patients' sensitive, personally identifiable medical information. Yet in the years since Congress has legislated and the NIH kind of effectuated the clinical trial data sharing mandate, there has been no evidence of serious harm to patient privacy or to incentives to innovate in this industry, even as independent research on that data has unlocked new uses of drugs and a variety of other social benefits. In fact, the pharmaceutical, biotech, and medical device industries never brought a single court challenge to FDAAA. And these days, if anything, the trend in clinical trial data sharing is to push further, carefully creating access for independent researchers to the most sensitive kinds of clinical trial data, especially to individual patient-level data, and to detailed methodological protocols that reveal exactly how companies are conducting their trials to generate and interpret their own data. So we think there are important proof of concept sort of data sharing initiatives that are being led by academic centers and administrative agencies in the US and Canada in this sector that show that even complete and extraordinarily sensitive data sets can, under the right conditions, be shared responsibly with trusted researchers. And sort of drawing lessons from this space, we really think those most important conditions are an application process to screen out malicious, commercial, inept, or undesirable data users, data use agreements that prohibit harmful data uses in specificity and that otherwise sort of shape researchers' use of data, and technical architectures that frustrate harmful data uses, for example, by prohibiting download and retransmission of complete data sets. So I want to quickly highlight a couple limitations, right? We recognize that the parallels between social media data and clinical trial data, not exactly one-to-one, right? So clinical trial data sets, far more standardized, far smaller than social media platforms data sets. Data subjects in clinical trials are volunteers. They're enrolled pursuant to, elaborate vetted processes of informed consent, while the quality of informed consent for data collection from users of social media is like laughably poor. Social media data, it implicates billions of people, clinical trials much smaller. Social media and other information technology companies claim to rely quite heavily on trade secrets to preserve their competitive edge. They can't patent their sort of recommendation algorithms the same way that pharmaceutical companies, of course, can rely more heavily on patents and regulatory exclusivities and fret less about trade secrets. So these differences, we think, limit the comparison, but at the same time, we believe that enough parallels exist, particularly at the level of law, right? So at the level of legal entitlements and legal argumentation that's being used by these two industries, we think that the history of clinical trial data sharing is quite relevant to the history of social media data sharing, even if the specificities of their regulation in social media is going to be more sensitive to exactly the kinds of differences that we've highlighted. So in terms of lessons that clinical trials offer, we're sort of inclined to focus the piece on sort of two simple lessons, right? So simple lesson one, the past and present of clinical trial data sharing shows that effective researcher access and use of industry data is impossible without powerful independent institutions that serve as counterweight to those powerful industries. So to support research, independent institutions are needed to serve many roles, right? They monitor and enforce industry's compliance with data sharing laws. They can collect, standardize, curate, steward, and share the data that has been sort of mandatorily accessed. They can govern researchers' access and use of data. They can educate, explaining to researchers and the broader public how to use data and insights drawn from it. And ideally, they can also sort of fund worthy research on that data. These institutions do not have to be public federal agencies, though in the world of clinical trial data sharing, most of them are. They can also be academics or academic institutions or nonprofit institutions, which certain smaller clinical trial data sharing institutions are, like YODA at Yale, for example. But our kind of takeaway is that whether or not you're sort of looking at like a federal public institution, a nonprofit institution, academic institutions, these institutions do need to be functionally and financially independent from industry. Pharmaceutical industry funded clinical trial data sharing initiatives in the 1990s and the 2000s sparked quite little useful research, and they failed to check the industry's worst excesses. Independent institutions also need the resources, the authority, and the incentives to enforce industry compliance with the data sharing mandate, which is another issue with sort of like the pre-2007 clinical trial data sharing system. And we kind of already have seen this in the history of platform research sharing. Things like Social Science One, right, were not functionally or financially independent from Facebook. Our second kind of simple lesson is that the history of clinical trial data sharing shows that different kinds of data have to be treated differently, right? That point is probably self-evident to this crowd, but we think it's worth making explicit, especially since it tends not to be the way that existing privacy law treats and thinks of social media data. So today, federal legislation mandates sharing certain low-risk clinical trial data, right, summary data, that characterizes broad trends, as well as certain metadata on how that data is generated. That kind of blunt mandatory disclosure works well for data of high value to researchers, of which sharing poses low risk. But for more sensitive data, right, like assay methodologies, which reveal industry's innovative and confidential scientific methods, or individual participant data, which poses obviously the maximal privacy risks for individuals, blunt disclosure to the general public would, of course, be completely inappropriate. So instead, more sensitive data is shared only with trusted researchers, subject to a raft of carefully tailored constraints on access and use. So again, basic lessons here for this group, but not generally always part of the conversation elsewhere, is that access to sensitive data has to be tiered, contextual, and closely governed. This lesson makes us sort of contributors to an expanding literature that recognizes that binary definitions of privacy are inadequate, and recognizes the hazards of mistaking transparency as an end in and of itself. And I just want to kind of quickly close with like 3 goals we have for this paper. So one is to sort of bridge 2 distinct subliteratures that exist in the field of privacy law. The subliterature on social media platforms and platform data, and the subliterature on medical data. The majority of writing on the governance of medical data, including clinical trial data, kind of sits in the medical and scientific literature rather than in law reviews. And even that does sit in law reviews is often kind of seen as health law and not speaking to and contributing insights to the privacy law literature. So as a result, we don't think it's really received sufficient attention from legal scholars outside the field of health law. And we see value in providing new audiences with just like thick, descriptive, positivist accounts of how laws, institutions, and technology of medical data sharing function. The description is really for scholars laboring on the massive project of figuring out how to govern social media data and other digital technologies. The second kind of goal we have is policy intervention, right? We want to inform and influence the very active sort of live legislative debate over proposed legislation and regulation that would force social media companies to share more data. Policymakers can often kind of get overwhelmed by the privacy and trade secrecy arguments that are being offered here, kind of think it can't be done, or how are we going to sort of overcome these arguments? And we think sort of pointing to this other regulated area where it has been done and the sky did not fall is kind of empowering to the political and policy imagination and will in this kind of relatively new untested space that is sort of the digital technologies regulation. And the third kind of goal for the paper is to contribute some tangible applications to an emerging scholarly literature and kind of rising civil society movement that wants to kind of break from the purely defensive stance of data privacy law to a more ambitious and optimistic project of data governance, right? A lot of ink has been spilled, especially in kind of like the law and technology privacy space, documenting and analyzing the problems that afflict social media and our broader civil digital society. We don't disagree with those diagnoses, but we kind of worry that obsessive attention on invasions of privacy and the powerlessness of social media's individual users has kind of left us to neglect and maybe even leave demoralized the work of solving these problems. So perhaps Pollyannish, over optimistically, we kind of hope our paper will form one small part of a bigger project of kind of developing a more affirmative, offensive agenda to transform social media and other vital features of the information society. So I will maybe pause there. I think I'm right about on time, maybe even a little early. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so that we can hopefully open things up for Q&A. Thank you.
Fantastic. Salome, that's a fantastic landing point, time-wise and substantively. Thank you so much.
Great.
I have 1,000 questions, but Salome knows my work, and so she could probably anticipate some of mine. But let me lean back and invite questions. Angela Daly asks in the chat, is the paper available even in draft form?
It is not. We are hoping to get it available up on SSRN soon, but we have not gotten there yet. But okay, well, I'm going to stop share. Okay, there. Yeah, so we're hoping to get it out soon, but not yet. But if people in this group are interested, we have basically a draft that I think we're comfortable sharing. So I'm happy to send it out.
Okay. Great. Questions, comments, reactions from everybody who is watching online? I'll pause in case anybody wants to wave at the screen or raise their hand on Zoom. Okay, well, while people are reflecting on that, I am going to fill the void with a couple of quick things. First of all, just a couple of quick comments. That, like, I'm super enthusiastic about a couple of things in particular. One is your comment about institutional resistance. You know, I'm reminded of the phrase, it takes a theory to beat a theory. It takes an institution to beat an institution. And I very much appreciate that perspective. I see Ali's got a question. Let me just finish my second quick comment because I think it'll open some things up. So you're talking about the goal of linking what has historically been treated as research categorized as health law and bridging over to the sort of independent area that has been labeled data privacy and trying to unify those conceptually in the data governance heading, something that, as you can imagine, I am extremely enthusiastic about. But the challenge, and I think one of the things that is, you pointed in part to this, a contrast between the clinical trial data area and what you're talking about with social media, is that access to clinical trial data from a researcher standpoint has a kind of concreteness in terms of its social value that's relatively easy to articulate and therefore relatively easy to advance through legislation, regulation, other sorts of things. Whereas saying we need to study patterns of social media usage in order to defend democracy or in order to make civil society more robust has a very generalized intuitive appeal, but it doesn't have that kind of blood and guts on the ground traction, at least not to me, that would make the case more persuasive. So rather than asking you to respond just to that, let me plant that seed in your mind, perhaps. And then I see Ali has his hand up with a question.
Hi, thanks. That was very interesting. I really enjoyed the talk. Building off of Mike's point, just one thing I wanted to note is that actually is an interesting idea of thinking about the difference between clinical trials and then social media, in that in some sense, there's something a lot more tractable about the data that comes out of the clinical trial setting, whereas in social media, it's not even clear, you know, what kind of patterns you want to collect. There's a lot of discretion on whoever is collecting and disseminating that data on, you know, how exactly they want to present those different results and those different findings. So that could be an interesting thing to think about, is like, is there a difference between you know, how easily contracting can occur in those two different scenarios. But another thing that I found interesting that I wanted to maybe plant another seed for was this idea that you brought up about kind of the importance of a central institution or a coordinating institution. That's really interesting. And one question I'd be interested in is, you know, what is can the current research tell us anything about, or are there people who have insights about like how the extent of what responsibilities that kind of organization should have? Is it sufficient for it to, you know, be more like a coordinating organization, or does it require certain kinds of lawmaking powers? In that sense, it'll matter whether it's a government agency or a nonprofit.
Right.
So I think that's also another interesting kind of area that I'd like to hear more about. But I'll give some other people the opportunity to ask some questions.
Cool. And in the meantime, maybe I'll work through some of these. I love the idea. I mean, I happen to both agree that it takes a theory to beat a theory, and I love the idea of kind of extending that truism to our piece, which really does kind of proceed from the view that like it takes an institution to beat an institution. Yeah, you know, I mean, I think I take the point about like I myself would have said one of the sort of like dissimilarities between the clinical trial kind of ecosystem or space and the social media data space is exactly this, like, well, we need access to clinical trial data because like Vioxx caused a bunch of heart failure. And I think we can all agree heart failure is bad. So like, you know, there's a simplicity to that kind of like regulatory mission that we might be lacking in social media. But surprisingly, like that has not been the case. And I guess it's like the problems of social media being left like completely underexplored and unregulated grow greater and greater, that like concrete sort of like blood and gutsy problems that begin to emerge have become more and more compelling, which is like bad for society, but like good for the reform agenda. And the one that I am quite impressed by, unsurprisingly, like this one is kind of like bipartisan and everyone thinks is bad, is like teen mental health and teen suicide rates going up. So that plenty of people posit is connected to social media, but that's really hard to say for sure if you can't get in and like study whether or not there are causal effects happening. And, you know, we can quibble on like the various kind of legislative specificities with which researcher access has been like an answer, but it crops up as a solution even in like very conservative bills that, you know, have a lot of features that I personally would not agree with in terms of sort of like regulating childhood. But they also see it as like a concern that we don't understand the effect of social media on teen mental health. So it might be that the like blood and guts thing for social media researcher access is youth mental health crises and just like youth addiction to social media. And, you know, I think that that's like one problem among many, but that does seem to have sort of like broad intuitive, like people don't want their children to be like depressed and sad the same way that people don't want heart failure. So that's actually been kind of like a surprising feature to me of digging into this research, is that there does seem to be those sorts of like broad intuitive kind of like gut reactions that people have. Now, again, I'm enough of a social scientist to think that anything we do about that should be data driven, and we should like to understand those causal effects if we're going to intervene on them effectively. But I think that that's like a pretty easy case to make in terms of like granting researcher access. Ollie, your questions or kind of interventions are super interesting. Yeah, we obviously get this point a lot that like clinical trial data is so structured and like so defined and so like well specified, and like who's to say what social media data even is? Is it the ranking algorithm? Is it like your user preferences? All of those sorts of like systems are designed very differently across like Twitter and TikTok and Facebook and like YouTube and Uber, right? And that's very true. But, you know, I think, and this is like Gabe is the information, he's the data scientist of the three of us. And what he would sort of say is sort of, I'm going to channel Gabe now, is sort of two things, right? So one is we have a bit of a chicken and an egg problem. Like part of the reason that medical data is as standardized as it is in part because it's regulated. And so it has to be reported in certain ways to regulators. And, you know, it doesn't strike me as immediately obvious if you were to ask like a 19th century researcher, would you study the effects of tuberculosis exactly the same way that you would study the effects of like a chronic disease like Alzheimer's exactly the same way? That they'd be like, yes. Those are very different things medically. But yeah, we've sort of developed more standard protocols for thinking about and reporting this research, in part because it's regulated. So we do think that like some of the positive effects of increased regulation will also be increased standardization of the data across different platforms. If they have to start reporting user engagement numbers on like a certain metric, then that will therefore lead to greater standardization so that we can track user engagement across different platforms using a unified metric. That's not going to solve all of the problems. I don't want to be trite about the differences, but that's sort of one thing that we see, or sort of that we think will be actually a benefit. The other is that like we think there's room for there to be like multiple goals of granting researcher access. So some research access is probably going to be like super tiered to like a specific platform and is going to require access to data that is like pretty bespoke and specific to that platform. And it will be like hard to link that data to get it to speak to like, to get the YouTube data to speak to the TikTok data in that particular form to answer that particular question. And like, we're okay with that. We also think that there will increasingly be research questions that people want to design that look at linking. And we're actually interested to see what sorts of like cool research innovations develop to try to link data sets that are actually designed in quite different ways as kind of like a follow-on effect. So yeah, we think there is going to be more of that, like sort of differences and sort of in research access and in the data that ends up being generated. But we think over time, like there still will be a lot of value in sort of putting it all in one place and seeing it together. On the coordinating institution, yeah, we actually don't, I don't think we even all agree as co-authors on whether or not this needs to be like one institution or whether or not different institutions can sort of play different roles in this ecosystem. We think there's value in kind of a coordinating body. We think there's value in independent funding. That doesn't have to rest in the same institution, I think, in our view. But we do think that the institution or cluster of institutions needs to be sufficiently powerful and sufficiently large such that they can meaningfully kind of enforce and keep honest the platform companies in how they're granting researchers access and in whether or not they're complying with the law. So that's just kind of our litmus test for looking out in the world and like evaluating what we think is going to work and what we think won't work. But we haven't given a lot of thought to like more specific design features about that institution, because I actually think, frankly, we like disagree about whether or not it has to be public or like it can be a nonprofit, or like whether or not the funding power has to sit in the same body that is like reviewing research and vetting it. But these are fascinating questions that we should be thinking about and that we get to think about if we pass laws mandating access, and I think are necessary for making those laws effective.
Angel Diaz has a question.
Cool.
Hello.
Hey, great to see you again.
Good to see you. I don't know most of you, so just to say introduce myself, my name is Angel. I'm at USC. The question I have relates to race, probably unsurprisingly to you.
Yeah.
So when I think about clinical trial data, I think about how often the data sets in that context were also sort of not reflective of sort of a broad racial demographic. And I think a lot about what would racial data look like for platforms. And I think about your scholarship and thinking about sort of population level data sets. And if I were to ask Facebook, like, give me the data on, let's say, Latinos, at best, they might give me some data sets around like an ethnic affinity that they use for marketing purposes, right? And I would assume that you and I would think there are lots of other data inputs that collectively reflect someone that they perceive to be Latino that they actually use for marketing and for any number of reasons. And so I guess my question becomes, how do we think about how to even ask for racial data, given that it's probably not going to be something as simple as like teenagers have a birth date that they use to register for a service, whereas like the way that racial identity is constructed via platforms is sort of probably not intentional a lot of the time. And so I'm thinking about that, how hard it might be, but then relatedly, the amount of computing and resources that would be necessary to maybe run some of the experiments that you might want to have. I just have a feeling that maybe those sort of essential questions about disparate impact that groups are experiencing might fall way behind topics like teen mental health or other ones that are just like much more easily measurable. So I guess I'm just curious what you think about that.
Yeah. So one, I would say like, I think that's a big problem regardless of like, that's a big problem under the current system. And it'll be it would be a problem that continues to persist if we like change the governance structures or the legal entitlements, right? I think there are harms of living in a category that is poorly defined and under measured or badly measured, right? But I guess I do think, or I have some intuitions that changing who gets to answer the question of give me data on all of your Latino users. Do we want like an internal Facebook person asking that question, or do we want social scientists who are experts in exactly how that social group is categorized and constructed to be asking that question? So as a legal scholar, I'm like, who gets the legal entitlement? Who is empowered to get to say what a good answer to that question is? Is it the internal Facebook person who hands over the data, or is it a researcher who says, I see that you gave me all of the data on people who self-identified with the ethnic group, but I actually think in order to like, based on my superior academic knowledge of like how ethnic identities and racial identities are constructed, that you're actually going to need to give me data in XYZ category in order for me to be able to run my experiment to understand some particular effect affecting some particular population. I guess I have like some degree of confidence that like people who think deeply about exactly how those social categories are constructed and rematerialized in the digital and social world will probably be more thoughtful and more comprehensive in how they're going to go about getting the data they need to study the populations they care about. On the funding question, yeah, again, I think like this is why a big part of our takeaway is like you need independent funding from companies, because to your point, like it might be perfectly within their like best interests and their like profitability and like good pitch to shareholders to be like, we also care about teen mental health, and that's why we're funding research on teen mental health. But it might be less in favor of their bottom line to be like, we really care about like the Dalit population in India, and we're going to fund like a major research initiative to like understand how Dalit communities are like communicating online. Like there is not a political constituency for them to fund that kind of research. And so they're not going to do that because it doesn't get them any PR points, or it gets them PR points with people who are not wealthy and powerful. So like, why would they fund that? An imperfect kind of intermediary is like a group like something like an NSF that is looking at research design and like, is your research design answering an interesting and important question measured not by like, is this good for the company, but like, is this of social scientific value? Now, you and I both know there's a lot of political work to be done on which groups are considered like more important and of greater scientific value to be studied. I mean, clinical trial data, women's health is like has been chronically understudied for like a really long time. But I do think it's better at least to appeal to those norms of social scientific inquiry than it is for like which groups will it be beneficial for Facebook to allow researchers to study. So it's like a step in the right direction. And then at least we can like focus our political ambitions and goals on like making, studying Dalit populations as scientifically important as studying like, I don't know, European teens on Facebook. I don't know. But, yeah, so that's kind of my answer to both of those questions.
Hey, thank you. I'm apologizing for mispronouncing your name because we haven't met before. But thank you for joining. This is fantastic that you're here. So could I quickly follow up though, Salome, on your response, because I think there's a tension in between your response to Anhel's questions and your earlier response to Ali's questions. And it might not actually be a tension, but I want to sort of label it as a tension in order to tee up a question, and you can solve the tension. So in response to Ali, what the question was, like, so what are the institutional designs? Like, so what does this sort of look like? And your response was largely, sort of set the architecture in motion, and then optimally, so there will be an innovative, emergent kind of, we can't predict and we don't want to specify too much in advance. This is a space for innovation and inclusion and experimentation to figure out what the institutions look like. Right, that's the one hand. So on the other hand, in response to Anhel's questions, you're relying very heavily on norms of social science. And of course, one of the interesting things about the field of social media research is that there is a field of social media research, but it draws from many different social science traditions, right? We've got law, we've got public health, we've got management, we've got social work, we've got sociology and anthropology, each of which has its own sort of normative valence, its own sorts of trainings and so forth, but they are all, as we all know, sort of siloed in their own respects. And there's a kind of, the idea of defaulting to autonomous independent researcher to sort of guide, wise decision-making about what to study and how is somewhat in tension with looking to sort of opportunities for emergent novelty in the institutional design business. I say that that's more of an apparent contradiction or tension than probably a real one, but I wanted to sort of put those two poles out there to see if that stimulated any thoughts on your part.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I thought that you were actually going to touch on a different tension, which is like, if we're going to let the institutions just develop their own properties and who's to say, then why am I also saying like, no, the funding has to come from like this specific kind of body? And like, yeah. To which I was going to say, like, we definitely have identified features that need to be vested in an independent institution. We just haven't all agreed on at what like level of social, is it like at a large public research university like the University of Michigan or Pitt, or is it at like, is it like an NIH or NSF style kind of agency? Is it like the FDA? We disagree. But we do think it has to have those features. But to answer the question that you actually have, again, I think that my view, I don't know if I would attribute it to both of my co-authors. I think I would a little bit, is that like part of what we think would be cool, neat, from coming as something that would come out of a more sort of systematized, regularized data access method is more coherent norms of what it means to do good social science research. Because right now, a lot of what it means to do good social science research is like have a good relationship with the company you're studying so you can continue to get access to the data that you literally need to advance your career. And that one is going to go away. So, part of what the kinds of institutions that will emerge can help do is exactly cohere a more kind of collective form of norms around what good use of that data will look like. Now, you're right that there will always be subcommunities that are using this data very differently, but that exists right now for like, I also study the US Census. Census data is used by sociologists, it's used by historians, it's used by economists. They use census data differently, but within their communities, they have a good sense of what it means to engage ethically and to a high standard, empirical standard with that work. And I think an economist and a historian and a sociologist could at least look over and recognize like, okay, historians are engaging with census data very differently from than I am, but at one higher level of generality, they are sort of adhering to similar sort of principles of what it looks like to engage ethically with this data that presumably like a good sociologist, a responsible sociologist and a responsible economist and a responsible historian could more or less agree. Now on the edges, of course, there are going to be sort of like disciplinary differences, and that might continue to persist with social media data. Like management science people and public health people and sociologists like might have different ways of answering the like, what is a wise and complete researcher answer? But I don't think it's just like the researcher alone navigating this question, which is kind of what we have now, right? Like a researcher alone up against a platform saying like, no, based on the like constraints of my data use agreement, like this is what I want to get access to, this is what I want to get access to. Like, presumably some of the vetting bodies of this research will include, social scientists of all of those groups, and they will be able to sort of help that researcher not have to make those requests alone, or we don't have to sort of like vest that character with all of our trust that they're going to be able to answer that question well. They're going to answer that question in light of norms of their own disciplinary training, and presumably their research question is going to be vetted in light of the sort of norms of their own disciplinary training. So I do think there's both going to be presumably like some convergence in those norms, as well as space for the kind of like more granular specificities of different research traditions being able to sort of like ground and constrain and inform what good research or what like an appropriate and necessary request is going to look like for any given kind of research project. That was maybe abstract, but hopefully responsive.
Well, no, these are all just great conversations, and I appreciate it. We've got time for maybe one more comment or question, which I'm happy to supply, but if somebody else would like to raise a hand again. Okay, well, let me ask the sort of a closing question that's more practical. I'm wondering, Salome, whether you or your colleagues have actually talked even conceptually with anybody on the ground in the relevant worlds, either in the social media space or the philanthropic space or allies or adjacent folks, to sort of float this architecture of what you're describing and where it might go and the analogy that you're drawing and the outputs that you might imagine, is this still very much a research project on your part, or have you sort of tentatively sort of extended conversational threads in different directions? And if so, what has the response been?
Yeah, it's a good question. So this paper, again, not even an SSRN yet, is still very much kind of just a research project. But I think separately in our various kind of other lives, all of us have kind of extended. So again, Gabe is at the Center for Democracy and Technology. He co-authored white papers on granting social media access. They've explored a number of parallels to different regulated industries, including clinical trial data, and that features in the conversations that they have in DC on this issue. So he's at a DC-based organization, working on and talking to policymakers on these issues all of the time. Chris is very involved in sort of health access justice. So his insights are deeply informed. He's a clinical professor, so he also litigates by his litigation, by his clients, and kind of there too, sort of the parallels or sort of the hard one kind of insights about the role of counter institutions in that space is sort of something that comes very closely from his work. And again, in my work, sort of separately, I have kind of been around a lot of the conversations post NYU Ad Observatory of collections of social media researchers about developing robust regulatory responses, because clearly this kind of the two voluntary models of proceed with permission and proceed without permission are not sustainable. So I've sort of had these conversations with those researchers. I've been around for a lot of those conversations. I think the group that I have been the least around are policymakers. So I have less of an intuition, but I think that the sort of tentative sense I get from being around social media researchers is broadly positive about the role of sort of mandated federal regulation. And I do think, a lot of academics are used to institutions like universities kind of playing a mediating role. Here at Michigan, we have the Institute for Quantitative Social Science, which is, among many other things, a curator, a massive data steward, right? So I think the intuitive kind of appeal of that kind of model for academic researchers is there. But yeah, we haven't given them the pitch to get them to sign up for anything yet.
Okay, understood. Very good. So we're just coming up on the top of the hour. So I think that the fair thing to be respectful of your time and the time of everybody else who joined us is to thank you for an hour of very, very stimulating presentation and research, and looking forward to the completion and publication of the manuscript. There was one person in the chat who sent me an email who was Angela Daly, who is hoping to see the preprint. So I will share her email with you. And this was a spectacular kickoff to our series here at Pitt. So thank you very much for agreeing to do this and being with us. The miracle of Zoom allows us to collect and learn from colleagues literally all over the world. And to those of you who are visiting with us today, some people within Pittsburgh and Pitt, some people we heard from the UK, and some people from the West Coast. That's also a big win as far as the outreach that we are trying to extend with this series. So thank you, Salome. Big applause. Ali, we can hit the stop record button and